Now it's time to take a look at the past before us. Mr. N. Ram, Chairman, Kasturi and Sons Limited, publisher of the Hindu Group of Newspapers and former editor-in-chief of the Hindu Group of Newspapers, will introduce the eminent historian Romila Thapar.
Romila Thapar is a distinguished historian of early India, a very distinguished historian. I was going to say more, but I'm under an injunction from our historian to keep it short and factual. She is Professor Emerita of History at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi, having researched and written on ancient Indian history and on its early and modern historiography. Early India is defined, that's her invention, from the period from the Harappan civilization to the 13th century, or about the 13th century. Romila comes from a Punjabi family originally based in Lahore. Interestingly, the young Romila's interest in early Indian history was triggered in part by her army doctor father's visit to the Madras Museum, where the Chola bronzes made such a deep impression on him that he took back with him to Pune, where he was posted at the time and where the family was living at the time, several books on the subject. The other story, that is the stuff of historical folklore, is that when Romila wished to go to England to study for a degree in history, her father said, "I've kept aside some money for you, but it's only enough for either a dowry or a degree from a British university, so you must choose." The choice was unequivocal, and the rest, as the cliche goes, is history. Professor Thapar has been General President of the Indian History Congress. She's an honorary fellow of Lady Margaret Hall, Oxford, and of the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, in London. She has received honorary doctorates from a number of universities, including Chicago, Oxford, Edinburgh, Peradeniya, Calcutta, and Punjab. She's a fellow of the British Academy. In 2008, Professor Thapar was awarded the prestigious Kluge Prize, which recognizes and celebrates work of the highest quality and greatest impact in areas that advance understanding of the human experience. More specifically, the prize honors lifetime achievement in humanistic and social science studies, notably history, subjects that are not covered by the Nobel Prize. Professor Thapar's publications include Ashoka and the Decline of the Mauryas, A History of India, Volume 1, Ancient Indian Social History, some interpretations, From Lineage to State, Shakuntala, Texts, Readings, Histories, Cultural Past, Early India, Somanatha, and a book for children, Indian Tales. Her latest book and magnum opus, The Past Before Us, Historical Traditions of Early North India, is a response shaped over a lifetime to the question, does Indian civilization have a sense of history? Do Indians have a sense of history from ancient times? Ladies and gentlemen, we give you Professor Romila Thapar.
Thank you, Ram, for that very generous introduction. I'm delighted to be here. Would particularly like to thank the Hindu Lit for Life for this invitation. It's something of an encroachment, I think, to have a historian of ancient India coming in and talking to an essentially literary festival. But it's an encroachment that I completely approve of, because not just because I'm here, but because I think that the closer that various kinds of articulations get to each other and interact with each other, the better. Let me preface what I'm going to say by stating that the subject is a little abstract. Did the Indians have a sense of history in the past? The question is abstract. I am not going to recite a narrative of history, so please bear with me. And remember, of course, that all abstractions are based on narratives, and all narratives are based on abstractions. So there is that element which comes in. The texts that I'm going to be speaking of, and I will be talking about a large number of texts, are a little ambiguous in the sense that some people regard them as literature and some people regard them as essentially historical. But the main factor which brings them into the discussion is that they are all texts that represent the past. And for me, this is a very important criterion of attitudes to the past, to history. It represents the past, and the next step is to ascertain what is the representation, what is the past that is being represented, and how authentic is it. In 1956, a conference was held at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London and published as Historians of India, Pakistan, and Ceylon. We were all students then, and as students, we sat on the side and listened. A repeated refrain was that ancient India lacked a sense of history, and that there were hardly any historical texts that resembled those of Europe. This set me thinking, because a decade later I realized that this comment, although it is still to this day heard by leading historians the world over, was actually irrelevant. Even in ancient times in India, records were kept and reference made to some past events which were believed to have happened. The past is crucial to the present, since it helps create a sense of identity in a society and to its claim to status. And we all know that very well from the present today. The underlying rationale, although not sharply articulated, was how does the present use the past? So, in looking at early Indian society, I became interested in asking how and why what was thought to be historical was recorded and was then employed as history by various groups of society at various times. Many questions relate to why a society represents its pasts in particular forms and why these differ, and what was the purpose of writing about the past. I would like to ask some of these questions of the evidence from early India. Let me begin by asking the obvious question as to why history was said to be absent. This statement was not made in passing, so why was it made? European concepts of history, current in the 18th century, were the litmus test of the presence or absence of history. In Europe, historical literature was being recognized as a distinct category. Sanskrit literature, it was held, had no such category, barring one text, the Rajatarangani of Kalhana, and Indian civilization was therefore defined as ahistorical. Colonial scholars describe the Indian past as an Oriental despotism. This assumed, among other things, a static society that registered no historical change. Therefore, it had no use for recording the past, since one of the functions of such a record was to legitimize the changes that took place in the present. That such a complex society could remain static over many centuries did not seem unreasonable to a range of European scholarship, from Hegel to the utilitarians. Change is a nodal point in history when new identities emerge and the past can be reformulated. So, if there is no change, there would be no need to record the past or even reflect on it. If there is no history, then communities do not have identities. This allowed the colonial scholarship to create the identities and read the Indian past as best suited to colonial policy. The dominant identity in Indian society, as formulated by colonial scholarship, was that of religious communities, and that they were antagonistic towards each other in the past. Contentions of past times were magnified into confrontations, with little concession to the interweaving of cultures. This identity colored the colonial view of Indian history in conformity with colonial policy. As Lord Curzon put it, this became the necessary furniture of empire. The construction of this furniture required that colonial scholars discover the past, and this they did through the collection of data of all kinds and its systematic organization. The oral tradition of the bards of central India and Rajasthan was recorded, but unfortunately ignored by historians. Scripts that could no longer be read, such as the Brahmi script, were deciphered. Historical monuments were identified, excavated, restored, and studied. As an attempt at revealing the sources of the past and organizing them systematically, this effort was most impressive. But even this evidence did not change the history constructed with its moorings in colonial policy. Subsequent historical research in the early 20th century, especially by Indian historians, questioned these earlier stereotypes. Early Indian society was discovered as being far from static and underwent substantial historical changes. By the 1960s and 70s, ancient Indian history in particular had ceased to be an aspect of Indology and was increasingly a part of the social sciences. New questions were asked, questioning the colonial interpretation, as well as those aspects of nationalist history that were derived from these interpretations. An example of this was the periodization of James Mill, who divided Indian history into Hindu, Muslim, and British periods, giving undue primacy to the religion of the rulers. History as a discipline also began to change in this period of the 60s and 70s. It was moving away from the Rankian framework of strict historicity to more innovative ways of investigating the past. The question, therefore, was no longer why was there an absence of historical writing, but rather how was the past perceived and recorded? What was the nature of historical writing in early India, and how did it differ from other ancient societies? These are the questions that I am now going to be addressing. Another extensive argument questioning an Indian articulation of history was based on the concept of time in early India. Essential to all historical traditions is the shape and accounting of time which presents the past in a distinctive form. The absence of history in India was further tied to the erroneous idea that early India knew only a cyclic concept of time. This meant constant repetition. Time kept moving from cycle to cycle. The constant repetition annulled the uniqueness of each historical event. The cycle of the Mahayuga, the great age of cosmology incorporated 4 smaller ages. The length of these 4 declined strictly according to geometrical progression. And parallel to this shortening, each age was said to have registered a decrease in dharma, or righteousness. The length of the total Mahayuga was truly cosmic, being 4,320,000 human years. And in the 19th century, of course, they thought this was an absurdly long time, which since then science has made much more feasible. However, a repetition of events was not actually possible within the 4 ages. Each age, being shorter than the previous one, recorded a different sequence of events. It was marked also by a reduction of dharma that resulted in fundamental alterations of social functioning. The present and last age is that of the Kali Yuga, the time when the norms of society are turned upside down. Incidentally, this change also negates its being called a static society. The only possible repetition was of the entire Mahayuga, but this covers an unreal span of time. This span was terminated either by a catastrophic collapse of the universe or by being brought to a close by Kalkin inaugurating a new Mahayuga. Linear time, thought to be essential to history, was said to be unknown to India. However, it is often parallel to or intersects with cyclic time. It is central, for example, to the extensive genealogies and dynastic lists in the epics and the Purans. Descent is visualized very interestingly as Vamsha, literally a bamboo, where the node and its stem symbolizes generation and descent. The shift in astronomy from the lunar to the solar calendar made time reckoning in linear time much more precise and introduced calculations in eras known as the Samvat. Precise chronology was essential to the authenticity of documents, especially those stating dues and obligations. And for religious grants, of course, the auspicious moment has to be exact for the grant to bestow merit. Cyclic and linear time were used very differently. Cyclic time referred to the cosmological dimension, and its space was the universe. Linear time was tied to human activity within the spatial framework of a society or a kingdom. In this sense, linear time can be seen as a segment of the arc of cyclic time. Points of time could be recorded in either of the two systems, cyclic or linear, or in their equivalents, as was done in the famous Aihole inscription of Pulakeshin II, the Chalukya king of the Deccan, which is dated to 634 AD. So it was argued that the absence of history was because Indian society was static and used only cyclic time. But neither of these two arguments can be sustained. Let me therefore turn to the more relevant question and discuss what I see as the historical traditions of early India. In looking at historical traditions, it seems to me that there are in early India 3 distinct historiographies. By historiographies, I mean ways of explaining the past. And the 3 were parallel but quite different. These were the Bardic tradition, the tradition of the Purans, and the Shamanic tradition. The historiography of the bards, or the suttas as they were called, lay in their narrating events about heroes and clans in the form of ballads and epic fragments. It claims a greater derivation from memory as a source, and was preserved orally for a longer period than the other two. In fact, it has almost a continuity all the way from the BCs to the present day. It tends to be treated as a kind of substratum source of history. The relationship of memory to history, recently much discussed, is problematic. And now that oral history has qualified as history, there is much to be done on this relationship. I would like, at the moment, to focus on the other two. First, the Puranic, and then the Shamanic historiographies. In each case, there is a gradual change in form, information, and comment, moving towards creating historical traditions. The term associated with the tradition reflecting the past was Itihasa Purana. Itihasa literally means, thus indeed it was, and Puran, that which is ancient. Texts described as Itihasa could be of various kinds. Historicity, or maintaining that certain events did happen in the past, was not a matter of primary concern to the early Puranic tradition. But the Buddhist and the Jain traditions, referred to as the Shamanic, from Shramana meaning a monk, insisted on the historicity of their founders as well as the history of their sanghas or organizations. This established the claim to historicity as an essential component of the Shamanic view of the past. The origin of the Puranic tradition may be traced to the earliest embedded information, the nuggets of person and event in various ritual texts. The earliest were the Danastuti hymns of the Rig Veda, hymns in praise of the gift-giving hero. The chiefs of clans are applauded for their successful raids, bringing back much booty. But beyond that, even more for their consequent generosity in giving gifts to the composers of hymns celebrating their heroism. This is comparable to bardic material and becomes, in effect, the fragmentary source of what later on go into the making of the epics. Embedding this information in a ritual text, because the Rig Veda was not a text on history, it was a text on ritual, gave it greater credence and ensured continuity. The poets rightly claim that they have immortalized the heroes, for we know of them today only because of these poems. Heroic acts are enlarged in the epics, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, composed in their present form in probably the late first millennium BC, but added to until the early centuries AD. The many cattle raids of the heroes gave way to a single formidable battle. A distinction between the two epics is hinted at. The Mahabharata is referred to more often as Itihasa, that which is believed to have happened. The Ramayana is described as Kavya, with more literary concerns. The Mahabharata is about clan society and its conflicts. The epic could be used in various ways to legitimize the status of the clans, or to normalize unfamiliar social custom, such as fraternal polyandry, by making it a crucial feature of the narrative. The battle at Kurukshetra draws in virtually all the known clans and marks their termination. It is to that extent a time marker. The political system of clans, drawing power from heads of families and their relative egalitarian status, gives way to kingdoms with agencies of authority and power in a single family. The fulsome endorsement of kingship by Bhishma in the Rajadharma section of the Mahabharata is symbolically the funeral oration of a clan society. This is different from the conflict in the Ramayana between the kingdom of Ayodhya and the clan society of Lanka, disguised by Valmiki as Rakshas. An alternate Jain tradition identifies Ravana as belonging to the highly respected Meghavahana lineage, possibly associated with the powerful Chedi clan. Kharavel of Kalinga, in the later inscriptions of about the 1st century BC, claims this association. In the Ramayana, the confrontation between clan society and kingship is sharp. The text is a eulogy to emerging kingship. Lanka and the Rakshas do not conform to the norms of a kingdom. Their description, also interestingly, carries characteristic features frequent in Sanskrit literature for those without caste identities, from actual forest tribes such as the Nishad, the Bhilla, Shabara, and such like, to imaginary demons. Embedded history, by its very nature, and given the cradle of imagination in which it lies, does not ensure the historicity of event and person. The authors evoke a past, looking back at it nostalgically, an evocation common to all epic compositions all over the world. Epics, therefore, may be seen as repositories of a certain historical consciousness, but not necessarily as histories recording events. Epic and Vedic material was then reformulated into a summary of the past in the Purans. These were sectarian religious texts of the 1st millennium AD. The section on succession, known as the Vamsha Anucharita in the Vishnu Puran, for example, sets out the pattern of a historical tradition. It begins with the rule of the mythical Manus, terminated by the Great Flood, the first time marker. The post-flood period lists the descent of generations of heroes and lineages, thus mapping clan society. These descent groups are neatly divided into two main lineages, the Surya Vamsha and the Chandra Vamsha. The clans descend from specific ancestors and are related by kinship. The lunar lineages, listing all the sons of all the suns, fan out laterally and are the clans that are mentioned in the Mahabharata. The solar lineages, generally recording only the eldest son of the eldest son, come down in neat parallel lines and are the Kshatriya rulers mentioned in the Ramayana. Clan society more or less terminates in the two battles at Kurukshetra and at Lanka. A few generations later in this Puranic record, the format changes. A list of dynasties follows from the Shishunag to the Gupta, ruling from about the 5th century BC to the 4th AD. The historicity of these dynasties is attested from other sources. Important departures mark this third section. The dynastic lists are distinct from the clans. They are written about in the future tense to underlie a difference from the earlier section and for the authors to claim the powers of historical prediction, so that in the dynastic lists it was all so-and-so was born of so-and-so, and then this happened and that happened. And in the dynastic section, it is the Nandas will come to power, will rule, and will be followed by the Mauryas, who in turn will be followed by the Shungas, and so on. The point at which this prophetic composition stops gives us the likely date of the composition. There is an awareness of providing a chronology, as regnal years are given. The lineage identity of clan societies is replaced by dynastic identity and by reference to their caste, even if low. The Nandas and the Mauryas in the Purans are described as Shudras, followed by the Shungas, who are Brahmins. Unlike the clans, the dynasties are not related by kinship and are of different castes. The Vamshanucharita section, therefore, seems to have been an attempt to give a historical structure to the past up to the Gupta period. This was essentially a historical tradition viewing the past not in a form as we would do now, but in what might be called a genealogical mode of thinking. And here I would like to underline the difference in the modes of thinking in these segments. Genealogical descent was not to be counted literally, generation by generation, nor to be interpreted as precise identities. It was really to give an overall idea of the social structure. The watershed between this embedded way of recording the past and the more clearly historical texts dates to around the mid-first millennium AD. The various new emerging genres are specifically intended as historical. Insisting on the historicity of person and event, they are a departure from earlier traditions. Why does historicity become important at this time? Was it required by the new rulers, or the new Kshatriyas, as they are referred to in the Purans, who were coming to power through the system of land grants and conquests in the period after the 7th century AD? Or was this change also prompted by the alternate perspective of the Shamanic traditions, the Buddhist and the Jain traditions? These latter were more historically oriented and were writing their own version of history different from that of the Purans. There was now a difference of historical interpretation. Not only was their choice of what to record different, but the Shamanic tradition sometimes contested the representations from Brahman authorship. They refer to each other as the heterodox, the Nastika. For example, the earliest Jaina version of the story of Ram was Vimala Suri's Pavamacharyam, written in about the 3rd century AD. Vimala Suri projected an entirely different identity of the Rakshas, accusing earlier versions of having fantasized this identity as demonic. He also insisted that his version, unlike those of others, was historically accurate, thus making a strong claim to historicity. This is perhaps what we would today call a political dialogue. And this approach to the past continues into later times in the Jaina Prabandhas or chronicles. Buddhist historical ideas are evident in the Pali Buddhist canon, recording the teachings of the Buddha and the history of the Buddhist Sangha written after this time. Subsequent to the canon, history takes familiar forms, as for example in the monastic chronicles, recording the political religious role of the famous Mahavihara monastery in Sri Lanka, as narrated in the Deepavamsa and the Mahavamsa of the 4th and 5th centuries AD. The narratives begin with the chiefdoms and the early kingdoms of northern India, providing the historical context to the Buddha. They have much to say on the Mauryas and their great patron Ashoka, continuing from then to the subsequent kings of Sri Lanka. The Indian link legitimized the arrival of Buddhism in the island. The subject of these chronicles is entirely different from the Puranic tradition. Ashoka is a mere name in the Puranic dynastic lists, but from the Buddhist perspective, he is a powerful monarch and patron of the Buddhist Sangha. The difference with the Purans is ideological. The history of the Sangha has no echo in the Puranic perspective, and events are not perceived in the same way. Once Buddhism is established, history is determined by events in relation to the Buddhist Sangha. And then when you get sectarian splits in Buddhism, you have a variety of sanghas, each with their own historical narratives. There are many reasons why Buddhist and Jain traditions have a sharper sense of historical perspective. They were constructed around the teaching and sectarian organization of two historical figures, Mahavira and the Buddha. The history of the Jaina and the Buddhist Sanghas as institutions had to be maintained, and more so when each succumbed to sectarian splits and doctrinal differences. Commentaries on the canon and on the monastic chronicles followed, and these included references to the changes introduced. This was essential history as they saw it. Dates were calculated from the single central date commanding their chronology. In the Jaina tradition, it was the date of the death of Mahavira, generally taken as 527 BC. And in the Buddhist tradition, the Mahaparinirvana, the death of the Buddha, 486 or 83 BC. This date itself has recently been questioned as being some decades too early. Nevertheless, the point is that a single central date is the pivot of the chronology, unlike the Puranic tradition, which has a series of dates depending on who was ruling. It was just after the mid-first millennium AD that the Vamsha Anucharita of the Purans was discontinued, and for good reason. New genres, specifically reflecting history, surfaced. Records encapsulating the past and legitimizing the present were recognized, but their histories differed. What led to this change? The Puranic tradition introduced texts similar in form to the Shamanic and claiming historicity, but with its own ideology. Historicity was associated with political authority. Therefore, the new genres were linked to the royal courts and composed by its associates. Given the political arena of intense competition, encapsulated earlier in the theory of mandala, states competing with each other, the new kingdoms needed historical support. Coincidentally, there had been much discussion around this time among philosophers of various persuasions on the nature of evidence and perception, on logic, inference, and causality, all of which were concerns of the emerging historians as well. And I'm suggesting that there was a certain coming together, as it were, in intellectual life between those writing history and those considering philosophical concepts. These new forms of history appear to have been in part a legacy from the alternate Shamanic tradition and in part an innovation in the Puranic tradition. They take shape in three categories of writing: the charitas or biographies of kings and ministers, the Vamshavalis or the regional chronicles, described as kavyas despite their historical purpose. And here you get the interaction, the interface between history and literature, and royal inscriptions on a large scale. These new forms record events and persons of the past and the present, contain information on authorship and chronology, and have distinct ideological perspectives, all the ingredients of good historical writing. Earlier records are consulted, and explanations of past happenings incorporate an element of causality. When political power becomes open to competition, historicity is claimed in the process of legitimizing that power. And may I add that this is a process that we are very familiar with these days. Writing biographies of contemporary kings was often motivated by current problems, although the inspiration may have come from the biographies of the Buddha. The 7th century Harshacharita, the biography of Harshavardhan of Kanauj by Bana Bhatta, has a tangential hint of a younger son thwarting the accepted norm of primogeniture, a theme not infrequent in biography. In some biographies, even Vishnu and Shiva are made to intervene on behalf of one or the other contending brother. However, the central narrative in the Harshacharita concerns Harsha acquiring sovereignty over the region, which, interestingly, has a substratum theme of a Buddhist ascetic blessing the success. The Ramacharita of Sandhyakar Nandin is a biography of the 12th century king Ramapala of the Pala dynasty in eastern India. It recalls his reign and narrates at length how Ramapala quelled a revolt of his Samantas, his feudatories, presented as a vignette of politics at the Pala court. Rebellious feudatories were not unusual in these times, and the composition would have had an audience in many courts. The author, being of the Kayastha caste employed in the upper bureaucracy, was in the know of state policy, which is amply reflected. The intention in these biographies was to give the official version justifying the king's action, so it becomes another form of validation. The second of the new genres was the chronicle, the Vamshavali, of which the finest example is undoubtedly the 12th century Rajatarangani of Kalhana. As a genre, it was the document establishing the legitimacy not just of the dynasties that ruled in the region, but also thereby the kingdom itself. Chronicles were either updated in later centuries or sequels could be written. Early history drew on the Purans with ancestors linked to the Puranic lineages. In the accounts of the dynasties, there is much on persons and events that approximates historical writing. The transition to a state and a kingdom is often indicated by the presence of new functionaries and institutions as required by the state. The narrative of kings may have been influenced by the Shamanic texts, since it is a precise and sequential ordering of activities connected to royalty, governing, and patronage. There are chronicles from many places, and it would seem that from the early second millennium onwards, it was chronicle writing time. Most rulers tended to issue inscriptions recording royal activities and events. The format becomes fairly uniform. The opening benediction provides a clue to the religious sectarian affiliation of the king. This is followed by the prashasti, the eulogy of the ruler and of the dynasty, generally in Sanskrit, which is formulaic, although the information differs. The origins of the dynasty are given and the achievements of the previous individual rulers. In the Prashasti section, claims are sometimes made to Kshatriya status through inventing a myth that links the dynasty with a lineage from the Purans. Genealogies move from desirable links to actual descent. Some statements are rhetorical, but some allow of a historical narrative, set for the most part in a precise chronology. Earlier records where consulted are mentioned. These texts provide information on the dynasty, the authority issuing the inscription, the purpose of the record, the name of the scribe and the engraver, and the precise date. Very informative texts. When taken sequentially in order of their issuance by one king after another, such inscriptions are in effect dynastic annals. Let me now, in conclusion, reiterate a few points about the sense of history in early India as I see it. Much of what I have said would be relevant beyond North India, although I have not taken examples from other regions, and much of it also continued into times beyond early India. Why do I regard the Puranic and Shamanic traditions as historical? Structurally, there is an attempt to see the past in three phases. The myth of the Manus gives way to the mapping of the Kshatriya clans. Clan societies are perceived as distinct from the subsequent kingdoms, and genealogies serve the double purpose of recording the past and also servicing those that in later times wish to claim Kshatriya status by linking themselves to these genealogies. Let me give you an example. The Chandel, an obscure family from Mahoba in central India, thought by some historians to be of Gond tribal origin, claim descent in their inscriptions from the rishi Chandratreya, who was said to be of Brahma-Kshatra caste, and they link themselves to the lunar lineage, the Chandra Vamsha. A few generations later, they claim to be Kshatriyas, so they can marry into the famous Chahamana family of Rajputs. Claims to social origins are closely tied to history. The tradition shifts to different categories of authors. The epics composed by bards were later reworked by Brahmins to convert them into texts for Vaishnava Bhagavat worship, when Ram and Krishna are made into avatars of Vishnu. The authors of the Purans were from a similar background. Royal courts employed poets and administrators familiar with the working of the state to maintain their records. These authors had an ideology and an agenda that was distinct from the authors of the epics in the Purans. They were the more courtly authors. Thus, religious functionaries as authors do make ideological statements, as most markedly in the writing of the Buddhist and the Jain monks. Brahmins and Kayasts attached to courts have a different political perspective, and bards generally presented a history of those of lesser status, possibly the truly subaltern groups, often giving the counterpoint to the official version. The audience, too, makes a difference to the perspective of what is being written. Patrons change from chiefs to kings. Since there was an ongoing historical process, it forms a continuous thread in the perception of the past. A marked difference from Brahmanical authorship is noticeable in Buddhist and Jain historical writing. In these latter, the patronage relates to that between the king, not the individual, but the Sangha, the order. Parallel references to both strengthen historicity. Political power reflected in these texts has multiple foci and therefore multiple forms of validation. Many confrontations are referred to as also attempts to emulate mainstream culture in the new regional kingdoms of the post-Gupta period. This involves changes in the political economy and cultural articulation as evident even in literature and architecture. The royal court provides an identity that binds the region, but this identity has to be backed by what is claimed as history. Such history is provided in the new genres that are established through biographies, inscriptions, and chronicles. Historical change leads to a retexturing of identities. The past becomes important to legitimizing the claims of the present. This is a process with which we are only too familiar in the politics of today. But at least today, we recognize it for what it is and question it. The texts that I have mentioned in this survey suggest that historical traditions and writing in pre-modern societies can take many forms, according with the contours of a given society and its culture. Investigating historiography, how and why history is written the way it is, requires as a first step discovering how societies record and authenticate their past. Subsequently, these statements should be examined with the methods that we use today to determine what constitutes history, perspectives that require a critical inquiry. We can observe and compare the difference, to search from the early past for texts that conform to the idea of history as defined in our times is anachronistic. I would like to suggest that while in the early period of Indian history, there may not be a conventional form of historical writing, there are nevertheless many texts of a different kind that reflect historical consciousness. In drawing out these historiographies, I am not arguing for any indigenous and thereby supposedly authentic interpretations to supersede those of modern times. My argument is that with the texts we use as sources, there is a need for us to be aware of the perceptions that those earlier authors had and their representations of how they saw the past. Observing their perceptions can become a further step in understanding that past and could provide us with illuminating insights. In other words, we have to search for how the past saw its past as a parallel study to how we see the same past.
You will agree with me that this was a beautifully presented presentation of the ideas behind a major book, a major work. I called it Professor Thapar's magnum opus, The Past Before Us, published in 2013 by Permanent Black in India and Harvard University Press, the US. A challenging subject, and I admired as a journalist the way Professor Thapar presented difficult ideas behind a challenging book in an accessible manner, but without oversimplification or let alone dumbing down, something that journalists aspire to without much success, and that we share. And the Hindu group of publications, as well as this literary festival, I think shares that value and that approach. We greatly admire that. Having said that, I think there's time for 2 or 2.5 questions. Please make them questions and not elaborate comments, and confine them to the subject.
Hello. I'm Vijay, and I've been your student in the past. Professor Thapar, my question was, where do you differentiate history, memory, and narrative, that comes down as a genealogy or a chronology, What is the kind, when you're narrating your histories, when you've been writing down, going by your books, all your earlier books, how much of it is history, memory, and the difference? That's what I'm trying to get there.
Thank you.
I'm sure you get that.
The point that I was trying to make was that memory is not something that rises up on its own, like yeast in bread. Memory is constructed. As we all know, when we talk about our previous years, we construct a memory. A photograph very seldom agrees with our idea of what was visually there. So, in the process of constructing a memory, when a historian takes memory as a source, the historian has to investigate what was the construction of that memory. That is very important. You cannot take memory as a source and leave it and just take it literally. You have to see how it was constructed. And once you've done that, you then move on to the level of creating a narrative out of what you have discovered through the construction of the memory.
Good morning, madam. In your speech, you have mentioned the absence of history in India was due to the community was static or the society was static. But I beg to differ you, madam, because if you go into the past, we will study the different dynasties they ruled India, and also there were political activities, mobility of the people, there were different the economic activities also took place.
Yeah, thank you.
But, so one minute. At the same time, even Kautilya's Arthasastra, he has mentioned that there were activities between the north and south. In such a case, I beg to differ with madam, there were mobility and also there were activities, and one of the reasons for absence of history was
you made
there
your
were
point.
no initiative to record these incidents.
You made your point, yeah.
I'm afraid I think you didn't quite follow what I was saying, because my entire talk was to try and disagree with the colonial scholarship that said it was a static society.
I'm Shrutajit, and I'm a physicist. My question is, engineers and scientists...
Would you please stand up so everyone can see you?
Yes.
Otherwise it looks like a disembodied voice.
Okay, I'll try to be embodied. Right, engineers and scientists are also part of society who are interested in the study of history in their own way. For instance, we are applying concepts of energy flow and fluid mechanics to study the interiors of houses in the Indus Valley civilization. As a preeminent historian, what advice can you give modern physicists and engineers, and one of them is sitting right next to me? How should we interpret history so that engineering and fluid mechanics can make sense truthfully?
Well, I must confess that I am completely for interdisciplinary research of this kind. Of course, there is much more occasion if you're using archaeological data for people in the natural and physical sciences to contribute, and I'm glad to hear that this is happening. It's much more difficult if you're using abstract ideas taken out of a text. Then it's really more the linguistic and the humanity, the literary side that you want help from, or dialogue with. But I think it's very necessary, whilst this research is going on, for people to be working very closely with archaeologists and historians. The only example I can give you is my apprehensions about DNA research, where generalizations by the dozen are made about, the Aryans, the non-Aryans, the nature of people, castes, the purity of castes, and this and that, on the basis of DNA samples. Now, if only people working on DNA samples would also bring historians in, social historians, who have worked on caste, and social anthropologists and sociologists, to question some of the basic assumptions with which the geneticist begins. When the geneticist moves from describing what he or she has found to generalizing of a historical kind. So I think it's terribly necessary that whatever work is being done should be seen as a dialogue between people in different disciplines working on the same problem. But I'm all for it, yeah.
I'm Prahlad Shekhawat, writer and freelance journalist. I was just coming from Madurai International Philosophy Congress, and the question came up again and again. Do you agree with Professor Daya Krishna, leading philosopher, that the Shruti and the Vedas and the Upanishads are evolving historically, and they have been produced by certain authors and families, and therefore they can be even dated if the historians like you can do that. So therefore it is not a fixed truth. It is open to different interpretation and evolution. Thank you.
Yes, I think, well, this would be true of many texts, especially philosophical texts, that you're really not dealing with fixed truths. You're dealing with thoughts and concepts and so on that are evolving. I mean, I would certainly not say that historians are dealing with definitive facts at a certain point. You do find that even facts tend to be questioned. And the texts like these, yes, they're an oral tradition which in itself is an evolving tradition, even though it's memorized very, very carefully. And I think, again, it's a case of philosophers and historians and people in linguistics particularly, because you're dealing here essentially with language, should come together to do this. And it's the kind of thing that is being done in Vedic studies, where they're trying to locate geography and chronology of the Vedic texts. And there's been a fair amount of success with that.
So I think with this, we can conclude, and may I, on behalf of everyone here, thank Professor Thapar for a wonderful presentation.